Okay, let's really get into the life of King David today. We're pulling together insights from, biographies, various commentaries, different translations, all focused on him.
Yeah, he's such a complex figure, and our goal here is to really build a detailed picture, kind of explore all the facets where he started, that sense of calling he seemed to have, his very complicated character, obviously.
Right. And his legacy, how it endures, and maybe what his whole story tells us about, well, being human, about faith, about getting through tough times.
Exactly. We want to create that kind of biographical sketch. And when you look at where his story kicks off, it's really something. He's definitely not the guy you'd pick out of a lineup for a future king.
Not at all. The text for Samuel 16, it introduces him almost by his absence, doesn't it? He's overlooked.
Completely. So the prophet Samuel turns up at Jesse's house in Bethlehem. God's told him, look, Saul's out. I've rejected him as king. Go find the next one here.
And Jesse, understandably, wants to impress the prophet. So he brings out his sons, the older ones.
The ones who looked the part.
Right.
Tall, strong, probably looked quite regal.
Right. Samuel sees the first one, Eliab, and he's immediately thinking, okay, this has got to be him.
Yeah, surely this is the Lord's anointed. Fits the bill, based on appearances.
But then comes that pivotal correction from God. It's so powerful.
It really is. Do not look at his appearance or his height, for it is not as a man sees that God sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Changes everything. So Samuel goes through all 7 sons Jesse brought out. None of them.
None are the chosen one?
Hmm.
And Samuel has to ask, is that it? Are these all the sons you have? It's almost like he can't believe it.
And only then does Jesse remember David, almost an afterthought.
Yeah. There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is keeping the sheep, just out there doing the dirty work.
The future king of Israel, the most famous one, is literally out with the sheep, the one his dad didn't even think to call inside when the prophet showed up.
It's incredible. And this identity, the shepherd, it's loaded with meaning. Commentators jump all over this.
Because it echoes other figures, right? Jacob, Moses.
Exactly. They were shepherds too before leading God's people. And the interpretation often is that God looks for qualities developed in that role.
Like what specifically?
Well, being a caretaker,
Mm-hmm.
someone who looks after vulnerable creatures, protects them, leads them, cares for the weak ones. That suggests maybe they'll be a good steward for the people, especially the powerless.
So it's about character formed away from the spotlight, responsibility, maybe compassion.
That's the idea. Qualities developed quietly, not about public image. So David's called in. He's described as young, ruddy, handsome.
And Samuel anoints him right
Right.
there in front of his brothers.
And the text says immediately, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. This is seen as, the source of his remarkable ability, his favor, maybe even his luck that seems to follow him despite everything later.
Like a divine empowerment, a special grace. But there's also that slightly tricky detail right at the start, isn't there? About Samuel showing up.
Ah, yeah. The deception bit. Samuel's genuinely afraid of Saul. He knows Saul would flip out if he knew he was anointing a replacement.
So he tells the elders in Bethlehem he's just there to offer a sacrifice, which is true, but not the whole truth.
Right. It's a cover story. Kind of a mild deception, as one source puts it.
And you have to wonder, does David see this? Does the young man, right at this moment of divine calling, see the prophet using, let's say, strategic ambiguity to protect himself?
That's a fascinating question. Does it plant a seed? Does he learn that sometimes, shading the truth is necessary for survival, a tool he might use later?
He adds a layer of complexity right from the get-go. Okay, so we have this young shepherd, anointed, marked by God's Spirit. How does he bridge the gap from the sheep fields to King Saul's court?
Well, this is where the story gets interesting, because the text actually gives us different versions of how that happens.
Different versions in the same book.
Yeah, it's one of those biblical puzzles. In one part of 1 Samuel 16, David's already known. He's described to Saul as a mighty man of valor, a man of war, good musician, speaks well, handsome, the Lord's with him.
So already established, like a known warrior and musician.
In that version, yes.
Yeah.
Saul loves him, makes him his armor bearer. He's already in the inner circle.
Okay.
But then, chapter 17, the Goliath story happens. And after David wins this massive victory, Saul turns to his general Abner and asks, "Whose son is this kid?" And Abner says, no idea, King."
Wait, what? So Saul doesn't recognize the guy who was supposedly his armor bearer and personal musician?
Exactly. It's a completely different introduction. One where he's already known before Goliath. The other where he's basically a stranger, maybe a bit of a country kid, after Goliath.
That is confusing. How do people make sense of that?
Well, scholars have a few ideas.
Hmm.
One common thought is that the biblical writers were weaving together different traditional stories about David that were floating around. Maybe the exact order wasn't clear, or maybe they just wanted to include both versions.
Or maybe it's a hint.
Some suggest that, yeah, like maybe including such obvious contradictions is the author's subtle way of saying, hey, some parts of this story, like maybe the exact details of how he got to court or even the Goliath story itself, might be more legend than literal history.
That's really interesting, sort of letting the text speak about its own nature.
Hmm.
Okay, so however he gets there, he does get to court, and his music becomes super important.
Critically important, Saul's suffering from this deep depression, this psychological torment, described as an evil spirit from God.
And David's harp playing is the only thing that helps.
Right. The spirit leaves, Saul feels better. It makes David indispensable, at least initially, cherished even.
And then comes the moment that really launches him, the big one, Goliath.
Yeah. In that telling, David is this captivating, bold young guy. He's just outraged by this Philistine giant defying Israel's army. Steps up with just a sling and stones, full of faith.
And wins. Astonishing victory.
Makes him famous instantly. The text says all Israel and Judah loved him. The king loved him. The king's family loved him. He's got this aura, this inexplicable grace around him.
His star just rockets up. But, like his arrival at court, there are some, let's say, quirks or questions around the Goliath story, too?
There are. You mentioned his head earlier.
Right. It says David brought Goliath's head to Jerusalem.
But Jerusalem wasn't Jerusalem yet, not David's capital anyway. It was still Jebus, a Jebusite city. David only conquered it years later. So how's he taking the head there then?
That's a timeline clash.
It is. And maybe even more significantly, there's this other verse tucked away in 2 Samuel 21.1 time. It flat out says that a guy named Elhanan killed Goliath.
Wait, Elhanan, not David.
Yep, Elhanan, son of Jerah-Orjam. And it even mentions Goliath's spear being like a weaver's beam, the exact same unique description used in the David story in 1 Samuel 17.
So the Bible credits David in one place and this Elhanan guy in another, using the same weapon detail.
Wow. Yeah. So how do you square that? Well, the later book of Chronicles changes it slightly. It says Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. Some ancient rabbis suggested maybe David was also called Elhanan.
Okay, trying to harmonize it.
Right. But many modern scholars lean towards the idea that maybe the heroic deed of a lesser-known warrior, Elhanan, got transferred over time to the much more famous David to build up his legend. Or, again, maybe including both accounts is the writer's way of flagging it as, perhaps more traditional tale than strict fact.
It really makes you think about how these stories were compiled and what they intend to convey. Okay, so David's fame is soaring, and this leads to some really key relationships.
Absolutely pivotal. First, there's Jonathan, Saul's son. Their bond is portrayed as incredibly intense.
Knit together, the text says. Jonathan loved him as his own soul.
Yeah, they make a covenant. It's this deep loyalty that seems to override family ties, political expediency, a profound friendship. Now, some interpretations discuss a possible romantic element, given the language, especially Jonathan's intense love.
But it's debated, right?
It is. Most focus on the political alliance and deep loyalty aspect, while acknowledging the intensity of the language. What's interesting, though, is David is constantly described as being loved by Jonathan, by Michal, by the people.
But the text doesn't explicitly say David loves them back in the same way.
Not with the same frequency or intensity, though he deeply mourns Jonathan later, calling their love wonderful, passing the love of women. It says Jonathan was very dear. It's just an observation some make.
And then there's Michal, Saul's daughter. She loves David, too.
Which is highlighted because it's apparently the only time in the whole Hebrew Bible a woman is explicitly said to love a man. Speaks volumes about David's charisma, doesn't it?
Definitely. Some suggest their love was kind of transgressive, maybe fueled by a shared dislike of Saul.
Possibly. And Saul uses this. He offers Michal to David, but not out of kindness. He hopes she'll be his snare.
Demands that crazy dowry, 100 Philistine foreskins, hoping David gets killed trying to get them.
Exactly, it's a trap. But for David, marrying the princess is a smart political move, raises his status. And it's pointed out that Saul's tactic, using a spouse as a snare, well, David pulls a similar move later with Uriah.
Oof. The parallels. So these relationships, David's popularity, it all just makes things worse with Saul, right?
Yeah. Saul's paranoia goes into overdrive. David's success, Jonathan's obvious loyalty to David, Saul sees him as a massive threat to his own dynasty.
And he just unravels, starts throwing spears.
Literally throws a spear at David while he's playing the harp, tries multiple times to kill him, and he even turns on Jonathan, his own son, throwing a spear at him in public, humiliating him for siding with David.
It's a total meltdown. And the narrative seems to show how everything Saul does to stop David actually helps David in the end.
It really does. Every move Saul makes pushes David away, forces him to build his own power base, alienates Saul's own family. Saul loses Jonathan's loyalty. Miguel helps David escape. He loses his support, his sanity, and ultimately the kingdom, all while trying to destroy David. It completely backfires.
Which forces David into this really tough next phase. Life as a fugitive. An outlaw.
Yeah, for about 10 years, give or take. He gathers this band of misfits, discontented people, guys in debt or distress. Starts small, but eventually goes to about 600 men.
That's a small army. How do they survive? How do they eat?
Well, it wasn't pretty. They lived by raiding, looting, and basically running a protection racket, demanding supplies from local landowners in exchange for protecting their flocks and shepherds.
Like with Nabal.
Exactly. David's men acted as a wall for Nabal's shepherds. They also worked as mercenaries sometimes. Basically, David becomes a skilled leader in the brutal craft of banditry, as one source puts it.
It's a very different picture from the Sweet Psalmist. There's that incident at Keilah, too.
Right. Keilah was a town in Judah, David's own tribe. Philistines were attacking it. David goes in, drives off the Philistines, saves the town.
Yeah.
Heroic.
We'll save like it.
But the text also mentions that David and his men took plunder from the town they just saved. So it's complex. Liberator, yes, but also benefiting from the situation.
Okay. And then things get even more morally gray when he goes over to the Philistines.
Yeah, that's a huge step. He decides the only safe place from Saul is actually with Israel's main enemy. He goes to Achish, the king of Gath.
Becomes his vassal. Basically defects.
Pretty much, a perpetual vassal. And he has to maintain this position through deception. He leads raids, but not against Philistine targets.
He attacks other groups, like the Geshurites, Amalekites.
Exactly, non-Israelite tribes in the south. But when he reports back to King Achish, he lies. He says, oh yeah, I was raiding the Negev of Judah today, hitting his own people.
To convince Achish he's fully committed, that he's burned his bridges with Israel.
Precisely. And to make sure the lie holds, the text adds this really chilling detail. When David raided those other tribes, he left not a man or woman alive.
He wiped them out. Completely.
To prevent any survivors from getting back to Achish and revealing the truth, took their livestock, their goods, but left no witnesses.
Wow. That's mass murder as a tactic of deception. Hard to swear that.
It is. It's one of those confounding contradictions. And this whole period, living with the Philistines, acting as their vassal, using these methods, it created suspicion back in Israel. Whose side is he really on? That charge would dog him later.
So these fugitive years were formative, but also deeply compromising. But there's also that Nabal and Abigail story in this period, which is quite different.
It's a fantastic story. Really highlights David's volatility, but also the power of wisdom. So David's men protected Nabal's shepherds. David sends a polite request for supplies.
And Nabal, whose name means fool, lives up to his name.
Big time. He's rich, but described as harsh and mean. He refuses David and insults him and his men, calls them runaway slaves.
Big mistake.
Huge. David flies into a rage, gathers 400 men, straps on his sword, and vows to kill Nabal and every single male in his household by morning. He's using really crude, angry language. Total overkill.
But Abigail, Nabal's wife, steps in.
She's described as intelligent and beautiful. She hears what happened, immediately gathers a ton of food and supplies, and rides out to intercept David without telling Nabal.
Smart and brave.
Incredibly. She meets David, bows down, takes the blame for her husband's stupidity, but then gives this incredibly wise and persuasive speech. She appeals to his future, his destiny as king, urges him not to have needless bloodshed on his conscience when God establishes him.
It's diplomatic, but also kind of bold, right? Reminding him of God's plan.
Yeah, and one reading even notes her language, while respectful, has this almost flirtatious edge, skillfully disarming him. And it works completely.
David stops. He actually listens.
He does. He praises her wisdom, thanks her for stopping him from taking vengeance himself.
Yeah.
It's a moment where he chooses restraint, thanks to her intervention, a choice he doesn't always make later.
It shows he can be reasoned with, even in a fury. And this period also has those times he spares Saul's life, right?
Twice, yeah. He gets the chance to kill Saul, his relentless pursuer, but holds back. Cuts off a piece of Saul's robe once, takes his spear and water jug another time, but refuses to harm him. Says he trusts God to deal with Saul.
Shows a different side again. Trust in God over immediate self-preservation or revenge.
contrasts sharply with the ruthlessness we see elsewhere. But even with his own men, things weren't always easy. There's that incident at Ziklag.
Ah, when the Amalekites raid their base while they're away.
Exactly. They come back, the town is burned, all their wives and children are captured. David and his men just weep until they can't weep anymore. They're in dire straits.
And his men turn on him.
They're so distraught and angry, they talk about stoning David, blaming him for leaving the town undefended because he'd gone off, potentially to fight with the Philistines against Israel.
Wow. Facing death from his own followers, what does he do?
The text says, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." In that absolute moment of crisis, betrayal, loss.
Okay.
It's a key insight into his resilience.
Okay, so after all that drama, the fugitive years end, Saul dies, David eventually becomes king, first over Judah in Hebron.
Right, and then, after a civil war and the assassination of Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth, the northern tribes come to David and recognize him as king over all Israel.
A major achievement, uniting the kingdom. And one of his first big moves is capturing Jerusalem.
Huge. Takes it from the Jebusites, makes it his capital. Strategically brilliant, it's neutral territory, not strongly associated with any single tribe. Helps unify north and south.
And then he brings the Ark of the Covenant there, making it the religious heart, too.
Yes, a massive symbolic and religious act. And the description of him bringing the Ark in is pure joy. David is dancing before the Lord with all his might, practically leaping and whirling.
Uninhibited worship. But not everyone approves. Michal, his wife, Saul's daughter.
She's watching from a window, and the text says she despised him in her heart. She confronts him later, basically saying he made a fool of himself, acting like a commoner, uncovering himself in front of slave girls.
She sees it as undignified for a king. How does David respond?
He defends it passionately. Says he was dancing before the Lord, the one who chose him over her father's house. It's a sharp retort, and then there's that stark note. Michal had no children after that.
Implying a rift, maybe even divine judgment for her scorn.
It's often interpreted that way. A sad end to that relationship, highlighting the tension between raw faith and royal propriety. And as David settles into his reign, we start seeing that theme commentators talk about. His divided heart.
Divided heart, meaning?
Meaning he seems cold in two directions. He genuinely seems devoted to God, believes God's promises, writes these incredible psalms, but he's also deeply driven by ambition, power, military glory, and, well, personal desires.
Both things are true at the same time.
That's the portrayal. He pursues God, and he pursues worldly success and pleasure. And this internal conflict fuels both his greatest triumphs and his most catastrophic failures. He's not simple.
And the absolute prime example of this, the one everyone knows, is Bathsheba and Uriah.
The infamous story from 2 Samuel 11. It's springtime, the time when kings go out to war. David's army is out fighting, but David stays behind in Jerusalem.
Takes it easy. Idols.
Yeah. One evening, he's walking on his palace rooftop, looks down, sees a woman bathing on a nearby roof. She's beautiful.
And he doesn't just admire the view.
No. He sends someone to find out who she is. He's told that's Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite.
Uriah, one of his own elite soldiers, fighting for him at that very moment.
Exactly. Knows she's married, knows whose wife she is,
Yeah.
But he sends messengers, summons her to the palace, and sleeps with her.
The text really emphasizes David's agency here, doesn't it? Unlike Michal or Abigail, Bathsheba is just fetched.
Yeah, he's the active one, using his royal power.
Yeah.
And the immediate result, Bathsheba gets pregnant.
Uh-oh. Now the cover-up begins.
Right. Panic sets in. His first move, recall Uriah from the front lines. Pretends he wants a battle report.
But the real goal is to get Uriah to go home, sleep with Bathsheba, so everyone will assume the baby is his.
Exactly. David urges him, go home, relax, wash your feet. Even sends a gift of food after him. But Uriah, he doesn't go home.
He sleeps outside the palace door with the king's guards.
Yes. When David asks him why, Uriah gives this incredible speech about loyalty. The Ark, Israel, Judah, my commander Joab, all my buddies are roughing it in the field. How can I go home, eat, drink, and sleep with my wife? No way.
Wow. Uriah's integrity just throws a massive wrench in David's plan. His piety shines compared to David's deception.
Completely foils the plan. David even tries getting him drunk the next night, hoping he'll stumble home then. Still no dice. Uriah sleeps outside again.
So David's cornered, and he makes that awful final decision.
He writes a letter to Joab, his general, and he gives the letter to Uriah himself to deliver.
What does the letter say?
Basically, put Uriah right in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. then pull back from him so he gets killed.
Mm-hmm.
A death sentence delivered by the victim himself.
Just brutal. Using his power to commit murder by proxy.
Joab carries out the order. Uriah dies in battle. Bathsheba mourns. Then David brings her to the palace, marries her, and she has the son. Looks almost legitimate from the outside.
But the narrative is clear. Adultery, deception, murder. A terrible sequence.
And some analyses look at this whole period, maybe 16 months, from the initial sin to the cover-up, as this long slide. One interpretation connects it back to David's earlier moments of doubt, suggesting he fell into a kind of humanistic viewpoint, talking himself into bad choices, not praying through the crisis, just hitting the panic button to cover his tracks.
Driven by fear of shame, a lack of faith and forgiveness, perhaps.
That's the idea, that core hollowness or lack of faith leads him down this path. It's noted he doesn't seem to pray during this whole cover-up phase.
And Bathsheba in all this, what's her role?
That's where it gets debated. The text is mostly silent about her thoughts or feelings. Was she a victim of royal power? A willing participant? An opportunist? She's called a Rorschach test because readers often project their own assumptions onto her silence.
Revealing more about the reader, maybe. Okay, so David thinks he's gotten away with it, but then...
God sends Nathan the prophet. And Nathan doesn't pull any punches, but he does it cleverly. He tells David a story.
The parable of the rich man and the poor man's lamb.
Exactly. Rich guy has loads of sheep. Poor guy has just one little ewe lamb, loves it like a daughter. A traveler comes to the rich man, and instead of taking one of his own sheep, the rich man steals the poor man's lamb to feed his guest.
And David hears this and gets furious, right? Righteously indignant.
Absolutely. Declares the rich man deserves to die. He should pay back fourfold.
And Nathan just drops the hammer. You are the man.
Devastating. Nathan lays it all out. God gave David everything, wives, power, protection, and yet David despised God's command, took Uriah's wife, killed Uriah. And David's response?
No excuses, no blaming Bathsheba, no blaming circumstance.
Just straight up, I have sinned against the Lord, full stop. Takes complete responsibility.
And the consequence, or the outcome.
Nathan immediately declares God's forgiveness. The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Confession brings forgiveness back.
There are still consequences.
Heavy ones. Yes. Nathan says the sword will never depart from David's house because of this. Violence will rise from within his own family. His wives will be taken publicly. And the first consequence, the immediate one, the child born to him, and Bathsheba will die.
Heartbreaking. So this sin has long, destructive ripples through his family and kingdom.
Absolutely. It undermines his moral authority, sets a terrible precedent, and many see his later struggles as a father partly stemming from this failure, both his actions and sometimes his inaction.
Which leads to that horrific family tragedy, Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom.
It's just awful. Amnon, David's oldest son, obsesses over his beautiful half-sister Tamar. He fakes illness, lures her to his room, and rapes her.
It's described so brutally, Tamar's devastation. And what does David do?
The text says David was furious,
Yeah.
but did nothing. No justice for Tamar, no punishment for Amnon.
And Absalom, Tamar's full brother, sees this and waits.
For 2 long years, he nurses this cold rage. Then he arranges a feast, invites all his brothers, including Amnon, gets Amnon drunk, signals his servants, and they murder Amnon.
Yeah.
Revenge.
More bloodshed within the family. David's grief must have been immense.
When he first hears a rumor that all his sons are dead, he tears his clothes, lies on the ground, just utterly broken, shows his love, but it wasn't enough to prevent the cycle of violence.
Absalom flees, is eventually allowed back, but the relationship with David is strained. And then Absalom starts plotting.
Yeah, for 4 years he cultivates this image. Stands by the city gate, intercepts people going to the king for justice, tells them, you've got a good case, too bad the king doesn't have anyone listening, if I were judge.
Undermining David, charming the people, stealing their hearts.
Exactly. Playing the populist card, promising what they want to hear, leveraging any discontent with David's rule.
And why did this rebellion catch on? What fueled it?
Several things, it seems. Lingering loyalty to Saul's family, especially up north. David's big sin with Bathsheba definitely hurt his reputation. People were tired of his wars, these Milchamite reshut, voluntary wars, meant taxes, conscription, loss of life.
War weariness.
Yeah. Plus, general grumbling that happens under any long role. And Absalom himself was handsome, charismatic, and it was an opportunity for anyone feeling left out of David's favor. A perfect storm, really.
The rebellion forces David out of Jerusalem. Absalom takes the city, and then he performs that shocking act on the palace roof.
Horrifying. On Ahithophel's advice, Absalom publicly pitches a tent on the roof and goes into David's 10 concubines. the ones David left behind. A calculated act of humiliation and dominance.
And the narrative connects this directly back to Nathan's prophecy, right? Punishment for David's secret sin, with Bathsheba being mirrored by this public violation.
Exactly. It's presented as divine judgment playing out. Though, as one source notes, it's deeply uncomfortable thinking of God orchestrating an act involving the violation of innocent women as punishment.
David is on the run again. A king fleeing his capital, a real low point.
The nadir of his reign, some call it. But even in flight, there's that moment with the Ark of the Covenant. The priests want to bring it with him for protection.
And David says no.
Tells him to take it back. Basically says, if God wants me back, he'll bring me back. If not, let him do what he wants. It's this incredible surrender to God's will, very different from his earlier fugitive days.
As he's fleeing, he encounters Shimei.
Ah, yes. Shimei from Saul's clan. Runs alongside David's retreating group, throwing stones, cursing him, calling him a murderer, a man of blood.
And Shimei's perspective, though hateful, represents a real viewpoint, doesn't it?
It does. Shimei blames David for the deaths of Saul, Jonathan, Abner, Ishbosheth, other members of Saul's house. He sees David's entire rise built on violence and betrayal, and sees Absalom's rebellion as God's payback.
A harsh interpretation, but one rooted in the bloody politics of the time. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom gets conflicting advice.
From Ahithophel, David's former genius strategist who defected, and Hushai, who is secretly loyal to David and acting as a spy.
Ahithophel says attack David now while he's weak and running.
Which was probably the smart military move, would likely have finished David off, but Hushai gives different advice.
What does Hushai suggest?
He plays to Absalom's ego, says, no, gather a massive army from all Israel. Take your time. You, Absalom, should lead them personally. It'll be a glorious victory. Basically, stall for time so David can regroup.
And Absalom buys it.
He does.
Yeah.
He follows Hushai's counsel. And the text explicitly says God ordained this, to defeat Ahithophel's good advice and bring disaster on Absalom, a mix of human folly and divine intervention.
What happens to Ahithophel when his advice is rejected?
It's quite stark. He realizes Absalom has made a fatal mistake, probably realizes David will win now. He goes home, calmly sets his affairs in order, arranges his household, and then hangs himself.
Wow. With a kind of austere dignity, as one source puts it, an act of honor or despair or political realism.
Probably a mix of all three. He knew his fate was sealed if David returned. The rebellion eventually fails. Absalom is killed against David's explicit orders.
And David's reaction to Absalom's death is just gut-wrenching.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would God, I had died for thee, oh Absalom, my son, my son. Pure agony. The political victory means nothing to him in that moment. Just the grief of a father for his lost rebellious son shows that divided heart again, the king versus the father.
So, looking past all the drama and tragedy, what's the lasting legacy? What did David actually achieve as king?
Well, quite a lot, foundationally. He establishes Jerusalem as the capital, unifying the nation politically and religiously. He effectively breaks the Philistine dominance, securing Israel's borders. He unites the northern and southern tribes, creating a unified kingdom that lasted for a couple of generations.
He proposed the temple.
Right. Conceived the idea, gathered materials, even though Solomon built it, and crucially, he founded a dynasty. The House of David ruled Judah for centuries.
And we have evidence for that dynasty outside the Bible now, don't we?
Yes, that's huge. The Tel Dan still and the Mesha still, inscriptions from the 9th century BC, maybe 150 years after David, both were written by enemies of Judah-Israel.
And they mention the House of David.
Explicitly, referring to the ruling dynasty in Judah. It's powerful confirmation that there really was a historical dynasty tracing its lineage back to a figure named David. Game-changing discoveries for biblical history.
Amazing. So this incredibly flawed man, adulterer, murderer, sometimes failed father, yet also poet, warrior, man of faith, why is he the one chosen in tradition as the ancestor of the Messiah?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources suggest the biblical idea of the Messiah, the shoot from Jesse's stump, isn't necessarily about a perfect supernatural being, but more like the ultimate human leader, a summation of human experience.
And David fits that because he's flawed, because he experienced the whole range.
That's the argument, precisely because he embodies the plenitude of human expression, the heights of faith and courage, the depths of sin and failure. He lived it all. Nobility and savagery, devotion and deception.
Unlike our tendency sometimes to want sanitized heroes, perfect saints.
Right. Conventional religion might prefer the exalted parts. But the Bible, as noted, is often brutally realistic. It's full of broken people and messy situations. It depicts the world, perhaps, as that broken hallelujah.
Broken hallelujah. I like that. It really captures David. His story resonates because it feels real, touches on things we still deal with.
Absolutely. Family conflict, ambition's price, hypocrisy that can creep into piety, the capacity for both good and evil in all of us. It's all there in David's life.
So, bringing it home, what are the takeaways? What lessons can we draw from this complex life based on the sources?
Well, a big one is God as refuge. We see David turning to God in extreme distress, hiding in caves, writing Psalms like 142 about God being his portion, his hope, or at Ziklag, when his own men want to stone him, he strengthened himself in the Lord his God.
Finding strength in faith when everything else crumbles.
And then there's the power of confession. His response to Nathan, I have sinned, no excuses, just owning it. That's presented as the key to forgiveness and restoration. Not being perfect, but being honest about imperfection.
Facing the truth.
And that phrase, a man after God's own heart, it's interpreted less as perfect and more as someone who cares about God's ways, who genuinely wants to follow them and keeps coming back even after messing up badly. The orientation of the heart matters.
The desire, the effort, the return.
Yeah. And maybe the overarching message is that God works with flawed people, uses us despite weaknesses, forgives monumental failures, stays with us through all the difficult people and situations, the Sauls, the Goliaths, the Jonathans, Abigails, Bathshebas, Absaloms, in our own lives. David's story teaches really significant truths about that grace.
It definitely challenges easy answers. His life shows faith isn't simple, character isn't simple. Profound failure doesn't have to be the final word.
Exactly. You can be deeply flawed and deeply used by God. You can wrestle with light and shadow your whole life. That's the journey David models.
We've covered so much, from that overlooked shepherd boy, the surprise anointing, the tangled court life, the fugitive years, the kingship, that terrible fall with Bathsheba, the family heartbreak rebellion, and this lasting, complex legacy.
It's a story that grabs you because it is so honest, so raw. It really does show that full range, the plenitude of human expression, good and bad.
And maybe that's the point. Perhaps the reason the Bible preserves David's story, warts and all the faith and the failure, the love and the lust, the triumphs and the tragedies, isn't despite the flaws, but because of them. Because his journey through that mess, sometimes stumbling, sometimes soaring, but always in relationship with God, makes him relatable, makes him enduring. He truly is that broken hallelujah, somehow reflecting God's grace even in the brokenness. What does David's story make you think about faith, forgiveness, and the messy, complicated business of being human?